Boom, boom, boom. Welcome to Franchise Mode. We just dropped another banger today on this episode. I had one of my closest friends today. It was a really good episode. We got a chance to talk a little Dallas Cowboys, a little NFC East, and some analytics. So if you're on the Apple or the Spotify for the full episode, make sure to follow us. Make sure to subscribe to us. And if you're on the YouTube and you're just watching one of our clips, continue to like, continue to share, and continue to subscribe. And here's the full episode. Okay, thank you all. I told you all we had a very special guest coming on. I have Eric Eager from Pro Football Focus. He's one of the best data analysts that they have there. Been following for like 2 years now or something like that. Just keeping up with all the work, trying to learn as much as I can about football. So I definitely appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me. This is it's a lot of fun to just chat football with people, and this is great.
Yeah, definitely. So we're going to get right into it. We're going to start with Dallas Cowboys. A lot of people have been flooding my DMs over the last month just with so many different Cowboys questions since the draft. But first, I want to start off with just like been the biggest buzz, what do you think is going to happen with the Zeke versus Tony Pollard situation? Like, what's your takeaway from that running back core?
Yeah, I think, Zeke is like the only player in league history to like decline in terms of like yards per game for the first 5 or 6 years of his career. His trajectory as a running back has sort of been exactly kind of what it's like for most running backs, which is extremely talented player, gets onto a team. That 2016 Dallas team was good, right? They only picked in the top 5 because Tony Romo got hurt the prior year. So he gets onto a team with a great offensive line who had just 2 years put DeMarco Murray in the rushing championship mantle. So, he did great. And over the years, he's declined, as far as efficiency and stuff like that. And, he had fumbling issues, the last couple of years. Last year wasn't so bad. But Dallas continues to play him despite the fact that, you have Tony Pollard, who averages, 5.5 yards per carry, 3.6 yards per carry after contact. Career average of 5.1 yards per carry if you take 2020 and 2019 into effect as well. And I think a lot of people, I think rightfully ask, okay, why isn't Pollard getting the run over Zeke? And there's a few reasons. I think the first one is that, Zeke is very good at some of the things that running backs need to do that don't go on the stat sheet. I think he's a good blocker. When you look at some of the GPS tracking data, players bite on play action to Zeke more than they bite on play action to Pollard. So there's some little effects there that help out the passing game. But I do think as Zeke's contract, becomes more and more old, you're going to see more and more Pollard just because, the investment you're less trying to invest, justify the investment with every passing year.
Yeah. It's interesting too, because I've always compared, I thought Pollard was a lot like Alvin Kamara and that Zeke was like our version of like a Mark Ingram. Of course, Zeke has had more career, especially early success than Mark Ingram had, but they're that typical duo. You have your scat back, your speed guy that can catch the ball. It's going to be able to break it away. Then you have your power back. It's going to do all the dirty work, the pass blocking, the run between the tackles. And a lot of stuff that Keller Moore seemingly has done on a lot of earlier downs. So I also think that's why Pollard might start to get a little bit more third down work and maybe a little flex slot Z work this year. I've heard a lot of that in training camp. I think that'll be interesting. But then I also saw about your offensive coordinators list. So it was like Keller Moore ranked 30th in play call uniqueness last year. But you had him ranked as the second best play caller in general. And why was that?
I just think that, that team underwent a lot of issues. So I don't think they run anything like super unique or super the Shanahan does something different than everybody else. So and so does McVay to a certain extent, and Arthur Smith. But Arthur Smith was like a top 5 play caller in terms of uniqueness, but I didn't think he did a great job play calling last year. I think he ran a unique scheme, but he did it poorly. I think, with Moore, I think Moore runs a pretty traditional NFL offense, but he gets, in my opinion, more out of that team than the talent. And I think most Dallas Cowboys fans and observers think that Dallas has a lot of talent. And I agree that they do. But that team last year specifically, and the year before, and you know, I think that the year before is telling as well. That team got clawed back into the playoff race without their quarterback and without, you know, a significant part of their offensive line. But even last year, they go to Minnesota with Cooper Rush. They put up 416 yards in that game. They win. You know, Amari Cooper was kind of a shell of himself for a lot of last season. You know, Dak was a shell of himself, you know, prior to the bye, prior to when, you know, Dak got injured. That team was putting up 500 yards on offense repeatedly, right? Like, obviously a lot of that goes to the players, but some of that has to go to the coach. You know, they're a team top 3 in yards per play, the top team in terms of points per game. You know, they're just a very good offense. And yet when you look at some of the adversity they had to deal with, you had, you know, Gallup going down with an injury. Tyron Smith didn't play every single game. La'el Collins fell off a little bit and wasn't a starter at right tackle for the most part. You know, at tight end, they had to deal with, Blake Jarwin coming back from injury and not being quite as good. And then you've had the decline that, you know, I spoke about Zeke and some of the stuff he does well, but he's not nearly as good of a running back as he was when he was younger. So you had the decline of Zeke, the decline of Amari Cooper. You had Dak coming back from injury, and that team was still pretty good on offense despite all those things. And I think you have to gobble up some of that credit on Keller Moore's plate.
Yeah, I think Keller Moore has been severely underrated. And it's actually, I think if we probably beat the 49ers in that playoff game, he probably is a head coach. It's crazy how like it's so the smallest things can change your life in that type of way. But if we beat the 49ers and maybe we get another win and make the NFC Championship game, him and possibly even Dan Quinn are both probably head coaches in the NFL right now. I think that game could have possibly cost both of them a head coaching job.
Yeah, and especially the last play of the game, and you never know. Like, I hate to judge a guy on one play. Like, you know, everybody's, you know, judging Kellen Moore based upon the run to Prescott and stuff, and I certainly get that. But like, no one wants to judge Shanahan for punting on 4th and 2 against the Rams and basically punting a Super Bowl opportunity away, right? So there are issues that abound, you know, significantly with sort of every player and every coach. I mean, you know, when you look at Prescott, like, you know, like I said, I think Dak was injured for much of the second half of the season last year. And, you know, prior to that, he was brilliant. And prior to getting injured in 2020, he was probably the most efficient quarterback in the entire league. So, you know, that's where it gets a little muddy for me. I'm not going to sit here and say he's, you know, the second coming of like Andy Reid or Mike Holmgren or something like that, but he's certainly a plus in that role.
Yeah. Okay. Now let's move to the other side of the ball. The biggest thing I think PFF has gotten the most flack for has to be Trayvon Diggs, right? The people have like been like, oh, we just don't understand the Diggs thing. So I think talking to other NFL players, other analysts, he has to be one of the most polarizing players I think I've ever watched and evaluated. So what is your take on just watching Diggs?
Well, you know, the hard part with Diggs is like, I think you have to look at the difference between what happened and what you think will happen in the future. So, you know, I think of Diggs. So there was a cornerback who played for Denver and Cincinnati way back in the day named Deltha O'Neal. And Deltha O'Neal was a player who, let me get up his Pro Football Reference here. You know, sort of Deltha O'Neal had 2 separate seasons with, I believe, 10 or more interceptions. And literally, like, the next year was like demoted to nickel and like and dime back because he was just getting burned all the time. And so, you know, my issue with Diggs is like, you look at last season's play, and there's no doubt in my mind he's valuable to the Dallas Cowboys. You know, the 11 interceptions is worth a ton. Like an interception is worth like 4 points to a defense, basically. And you know, he had missed tackles, and that was a high rate. Like, that was one thing that we dinged him on. Coverage was, you know, fine. Actually, his grade in coverage was fine. He missed a lot of tackles, but he did give up 1,070 yards into coverage, right? And so, you know, like, my question becomes, you know, if he gives up 1,000 yards into coverage again, but he only gets 3 interceptions, is he valuable to the team? Because I think, you know, the question is like, how repeatable is either thing? And I think getting beat a lot and giving up a lot of receptions is more repeatable than getting interceptions is. And so that's, I think, the question mark people have is not necessarily that Diggs didn't deserve like accolades last year. It was more that, if you're trying to tell me, and that's one of our jobs, is trying to tell me how good Trayvon Diggs is.
Yeah.
I think it's a little bit of a mixed bag because he is giving up a lot of yards into his coverage. He's just coming back and intercepting a lot of balls. Can he do that repeatedly is a good question.
So what do you think about him and like people like Marshawn Lattimore, Xavier Howard, like corners? Xavier Howard is the one that gets a lot of interceptions, and Lattimore is the one that's given up a good amount of yards throughout his career. So what do you see him in those type of corner modes?
Yeah, I think Howard's a really good example, right? So Howard goes, he has 10 interceptions. So Howard in 2020 had 10 interceptions. He only gave up a little under 700 yards. Actually, this is very instructive. He gave up 695 yards in 2020. The next year, Howard gave up 717 yards. Literally 47 catches in 2020, 48 catches in 2021. Remarkably stable. And actually, these numbers are not stable for most corners year to year. But it shows you he goes from 10 interceptions to 5, right? So, when you think about the impact that he's having, the impact that he's having from interceptions is cut in half, but the impact he's having from giving up yards is basically staying the same. You know what I'm saying? And like,
yeah,
that I think gets, to the point of where if Diggs had, 5 interceptions last year, what would have been the discussion surrounding him is the question. And I think most of us would say, we look at it and say, oh, it's an encouraging year because he really struggled as a rookie. But it's not necessarily this like, hey, he's an all-world defender. Lattimore is interesting. So Lattimore did give up 862 yards into coverage last year. He had 18 pass breakups and just 3 interceptions, meaning like when you look at Diggs had 11 interceptions and 9 pass breakups. So they got their hands on the same number of passes, but, instead of batting them away, Lattimore, didn't get interceptions. He just batted them away versus making plays on the ball the way that Diggs did.
Yeah. So sticking on the defensive end, one more negative before we end up on the positive, everybody. So we have the Randy Gregory loss, that whole debacle about, the contract, whatever was in there that he didn't like. So he ended up not signing with the Cowboys. People will say he only had 6 sacks last year, but his pass rushing grade was top 15 at the position. Or it was high at his position.
Yeah.
So losing someone with that type of impact on the side of a more power rusher, DeMarcus Lawrence, how do you think that would impact the Cowboys defense?
Yeah, it'll hurt. I mean, the last 2 years he has looks like 72 pressures in just about what looks like 500 pass rushing snaps. Anytime you have over a 10% rate, that's pretty good. So he's really in that category. Now, he didn't convert them into sacks. He was involved in just 10 sacks the last 2 years. But, that's part of being on a good defense, right? Lawrence can clean up some of the pressures that he gets and vice versa. It's always, going to amount to sort of like, if you can get pressure on the quarterback, the sacks will come. So losing him is a big loss for sure. Micah Parsons can probably, fill in a little bit as far as some, edge stuff on the late downs, but he's also very valuable as a linebacker. So, Jaron Kearse in the mix who can kind of play linebacker and safety. They have a lot of versatility on that defense. I think that it's going to be a loss, but, ultimately, Dan Quinn's got to figure out how to do it. When he was in Atlanta, Dan Quinn, he had, Vic Beasley, he had, Grady Jarrett, he had guys who could rush the passer. When those players stopped playing for him or fell off a little bit, that defense wasn't as good, right? So they are really going to have to figure out, sort of what to do there, because if they can't get pass rush, then you got Diggs out there on an island, and it's not as pretty necessarily if the quarterback's not being pressured when he's throwing the ball at defensive backs.
Yeah, I think that helped the Cowboys secondary was the pass rush. I mean, because Anthony Brown had a career resurging year. Jordan Lewis was one of the best slot defenders last year as well. You had Jaron Kearse coming over from the Vikings, who was basically a special teamer, your third to fourth safety. He comes into Dallas and basically finds a role, ends up getting a small payday. So I think that Packers had a big chunk in that. So I think Randy Gregory, I mean, I just think they're going to try to replace him, I guess, with the Dante Fowler, and they kept Dorrance Armstrong. They drafted D. Williams. So I guess they're trying to match something where they're trying to maybe go for more freshness at the position, I guess, than just go with two guys. We'll see how smart they are. But let's see. So for the last one, just to end up on a positive note for this segment, we have just CeeDee Lamb. I think everyone's been pretty high on CeeDee Lamb. I know you all on your show have been pretty high on Lamb this season, but just overall, how good you think he can be this year?
I mean, Lamb was already a top 10 wide receiver last year. I think he was hurt more by the Dak injury than anything. First half of the year, he was fantastic. He shed a little bit of the label. So when he was a rookie, he played almost predominantly in the slot. And then when he was a second-year player, he played, more of like how a number one receiver plays. He played on the outside a fair amount. He played in the slot a fair amount. He did get his 1,000 yards. I see far more productivity. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if he was a 1,300-yard receiver this year, and he's going to have to be. I mean, without Cooper there, they bring Gallup back on a decent deal. They're going to have to lean on him, and he's just going to have to be one of those players who, is Devontae Adams' this offense to be successful. And I think he has those kind of goods. I think, the grade data, his ability to get open, all of those things are fairly well substantiated. So it's going to be a big year for him. If he stays healthy, it's going to be a big year for CeeDee Lamb.